The main thing is lack of knowledge of the disease.
In the U.S., predominantly the people with sickle cell are of African origins.
Sickle cell just doesn't affect African Americans. It also affects Hispanics, Asian, Greeks.
The organization's mission has pretty much remained the same. It's to enhance the quality of life for individuals with sickle cell disease and their families. I started with the organization in 2003, but I first Googled the Sickle Cell Disease Association of Illinois upon receiving a diagnosis for my daughter that is now 9 years old that has sickle cell disease. So that means my daughter has sickle cell disease SS, which also means that myself, I am a carrier. I have sickle cell trait or hemoglobin AS trait, and then my husband also is a carrier of sickle cell. There's a lot of people that have sickle cell trait and may or may not know.
When you approach me, you know, I hadn't thought about it in 30 plus years, you know. So it's putting it back on the radar in my life. You know, I'm a father now, and you know, my son has gone through a number of blood tests, and it's never come up in, you know, any of those examinations. But then again, I've never asked him to look for it, so I don't know if the process of them looking for one thing, they don't specifically look for another. But from what I've seen, from the slides that you've provided, that if they look at the blood closely enough, it's something that can be easily, you know, discerned by the eye. It doesn't take any kind of exotic inspection to see it. So, but now, if anything, I'm going to ask.
We've provided a walk, jog, bike-a-thon every year since 1974, and also a Bright Horizons summer camp for children that have sickle cell disease, which began in 1983.
As if growing up with sickle cell wasn't difficult enough, making the transition from doctor to doctor, or even adolescent to adult, is a nightmare.
Transitioning, I think that's the biggest key. Transitioning from a pediatric doctor to, you know, an adult doctor. If you can maintain that rapport or establish, you know, that rapport with that doctor, that will go a long way.
That's something that like these kids think about. Like, how am I going to go to, what's like a rural town? How am I going to go to Carbondale? And the nearest comprehensive center is in St. Louis, 2.5 hours away. Because maybe there's not a hematologist at the nearest hospital and they don't understand how to treat sickle cell.
The reason why I moved back to Chicago is because I fell ill. One of the first things that my parents did was call my pediatric doctor. And, you know, she had me come in and she checked me out and everything and told me, you know, helped me get back on the road to recovery. When I was in Indianapolis and I told the doctor that I had sickle cell, they had no idea, none whatsoever.
Now, there's research that states in Africa, if you had, I don't know which version it is, but if you had sickle cell, basically it helps you fight off malaria. But I think that was just with the traits.
Correct, right. So people get a little confused sometimes. They want to make sure you're talking about the right thing. So sickle trait is quite different. So sickle trait means you just have one copy of sickle gene, but the other gene is normal. And that is very, very common across the world, particularly in areas of the world where there's a lot of malaria, which is the tropical areas and around the Mediterranean. And that's true, that those who have sickle trait have increased survival capacity against malaria. The very first case of sickle cell ever was described here in Chicago. And so that was in about 1910. And the way it happened was that there was this gentleman who was growing up in Grenada in the West Indies. And he was looking for a place that would accept a black student to become a dentist, and this is 1910. And there weren't that many places, but he found one in Chicago. But they noted that he was a little bit thinner, a little bit more tired, had these unusual skin ulcers on his leg, and his eyes were maybe a little bit more yellow than other people. But he otherwise seemed okay, and he was going to be a student, so they let him in. And he came to Chicago, started dental school, and then became one of the coldest winters on Chicago's records. And he got hospitalized multiple times for these mysterious pains. Nobody could figure out what it was. They thought it was rheumatoid arthritis, but it didn't really fit that. They thought he had an infection, but it wasn't really that. And then they did this new test on him, which is called looking at the blood under the microscope. This is high tech for that era. And what they found was that his blood cells, the red blood cells normally are a very round shape that are kind of like a little jelly donut. But under the microscope, you could see some of his cells were not that shape. They were more of a crescent moon type of shape, and elongated and curved. And some people would call it shaped like this farming tool called a sickle. So after they described that his blood was like that and he was anemic, they connected this with his unusual pains, his pattern of pains, and described the disease sickle cell disease.
If you look at the sickle-shaped cells, those are sickle cells. A patient usually, when they come in, they're in a sickle cell crisis.
It's a sharp pain, like a throbbing, squeezing pain, and from my hips all the way down. Usually, like when I get the pain crisis, it's always on my legs and my back, but this time it's just my legs.
Here in hematology, we process all CBCs and blood counts. And what we do, we have an automation system that is called a lab cell. And what it does, it limits our workflow and also help us process samples faster and get the patient results out faster.
It is important to get results back as fast as possible because it notifies doctors what diseases the patients may or may not have.
In the past, many years ago, before I came here, there had been a study in of transplant in sickle cell. And it was not too successful because some patients had major toxicity and problems. Now, the standard way to do bone marrow transplants that we normally use for cancer patients requires chemotherapy prior to the transplant. The chemotherapy has two goals. One is to empty the bone marrow, and second which is to kill the cancer. And second is to suppress the immune system of the recipient so the cells would not be rejected.
But what we're finding now is that with the new kind of transplant, which is more immunosuppression, kind of like a kidney transplant or a heart transplant, that kind of a transplant measure is able to be tolerated by the adults. So that we've had 2 adults who've gone through are doing pretty good so far. And so this gives great hope that we can actually have more cures of sickle cell in adults as well as in children using these transplant approaches.
So it was standard also in sickle cell to use chemotherapy preparation before the transplant. Unfortunately, patients with sickle cell anemia have already, those with severe disease, have already organ dysfunctions because of the disease. And so the chemotherapy, even if the dose was not too high, this new regimen that we just opened here has no chemotherapy. So that's the new part. So sickle cell can be cured only with bone marrow transplant.
Get educated. I think that's where we lack in our community in a lot of different areas other than sickle cell disease.
But now with Facebook and all the internet and stuff, a lot of patients and myself were out there posting videos.
It's going to take a concentrated effort on the part of the sickle cell staff to bring the public's attention to sickle cell anemia.
Particularly since it's something that's passed on from generation to generation, obviously from parent to child. You know, anything that affects childhood suffering, adults have an acute responsibility to, resolve.